Kwame had learned very early in life that dreams were a luxury. In his small village on the outskirts of Kumasi, survival came first and everything else came after, if it came at all. Each morning before the sun fully rose, he would help his mother set up her roadside stall, arranging tomatoes and peppers in neat rows that tried their best to look abundant, even when they were not. His uniform was always clean but never new, and his shoes told stories of long distances walked and longer days endured. Still, when he stepped into the classroom, something shifted. Numbers made sense. Words aligned. The world, for once, felt predictable. But Kwame never allowed himself to look too far ahead. While other students talked about universities abroad or careers in big cities, he kept his focus narrow: today's lesson, tomorrow's test, next week's exam. Anything beyond that felt dangerous. Hope, in his experience, had a way of raising expectations only to crush them harder than before. So he stayed quiet, sitting in the back, answering only when called upon, and disappearing the moment school ended. Yet even in his silence, people noticed him. Teachers whispered about his brilliance, classmates copied his work, and rumors began to spread about a national scholarship that could change everything. But Kwame ignored them. Because deep down he believed something simple and unshakable. Opportunities like that were not meant for people like him. Amma had never known what it meant to go without. Her world was one of comfort: large rooms, polished floors, and conversations about politics that echoed through her father's home like distant thunder. As the daughter of a respected politician, her life had been carefully structured, her path already outlined long before she was old enough to question it. Excellence was not encouraged, it was expected. Every grade, every achievement, every step forward carried the weight of her family name. But beneath the surface, Amma carried something few people ever noticed: a quiet exhaustion. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate her life, she did. But there was a growing sense that none of it truly belonged to her. Her dreams felt borrowed, her successes rehearsed. Even her friendships often felt transactional, built more on status than sincerity. So when she walked into school each day, she carried herself with confidence, but also with a subtle distance, as though she were observing her own life from the outside. The scholarship announcement changed everything. For the first time, Amma saw something that felt like a real challenge. Not one her family had arranged, but one she had to earn. And then she heard his name. Kwame. The quiet boy no one really knew, but everyone was starting to talk about. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she became curious. The entire school gathered under the assembly pavilion, the morning sun already pressing heavily against the air as students fanned themselves with notebooks and whispered among themselves. There was an energy that day, different, electric, almost restless. When the principal stepped forward, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat, the murmurs slowly faded into anticipation. "The Global Excellence Scholarship," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "will be awarded to one student from this school." A ripple moved through the students. One student. Just one. The requirements were strict: academic excellence, leadership, character, and a final examination that would test not just knowledge but critical thinking under pressure. It was more than a scholarship. It was a gateway, an opportunity to leave, to grow, to become something beyond the limits of their environment. Kwame listened quietly, his expression unchanged. Amma, however, leaned forward slightly, her attention fully captured. Their eyes met for the first time. Just for a second. But something unspoken passed between them. Not rivalry. Not yet. But recognition. It happened during a mathematics lesson, an advanced problem that had left the entire class silent. The teacher stood at the front, chalk in hand, waiting for someone to try. No one moved. Until Kwame slowly raised his hand. He walked to the board without hesitation, solving the equation with a calm precision that felt almost effortless. Each step was clear, each conclusion exact. When he finished, the room remained quiet, not because they didn't understand, but because they hadn't expected it to be that simple. Then Amma spoke. "That's not the only way," she said. Heads turned. She stood, walked forward, and presented an alternative solution. Different approach, same answer. The class erupted in whispers. Two methods. Two minds. Equally brilliant. Kwame looked at her properly for the first time. And in that moment something shifted. This was no longer just a scholarship. This was competition. The days that followed were different. The classroom no longer felt like a place of quiet routine, but a stage where every question, every answer, every moment mattered. Kwame found himself more aware of the lessons, of the expectations, and most unexpectedly, of Amma. She was everywhere. Not in an overwhelming way, but in a constant, undeniable presence. Answering questions. leading discussions, challenging ideas. And every time she spoke, she seemed to look in his direction, not directly but just enough to make him wonder. Amma, on the other hand, was equally aware of him. There was something about Kwame that unsettled her, not because he intimidated her but because he didn't play by the same rules. He didn't seek attention. He didn't try to impress. And yet he stood out more than anyone else. One afternoon their paths crossed outside the classroom. "Your solution was good," she said simply. Kwame hesitated, then nodded. "So was yours. It wasn't much. But it was the beginning." And neither of them knew yet that what started as competition would slowly become something neither of them had planned. The days grew heavier, not just with heat but with expectation. Every lesson now carried an invisible weight. Every test felt like a silent comparison. Kwame noticed it first, not in the way people spoke but in how they looked at him. Teachers lingered longer when reviewing his work. Classmates whispered more often. And somehow, his name had become part of conversations he was never invited into. Still he kept his routine unchanged. School, home, stall, study, repeat. Amma, however, was beginning to feel something different, something unfamiliar. For the first time in her life, she wasn't ahead without effort. Kwame's presence had disrupted the quiet certainty she had always carried. It wasn't just that he was brilliant. It was that he didn't seem to need validation. He wasn't competing loudly, yet somehow he was always there, always equal, always close. One afternoon, as the class dispersed, Amma watched him from a distance. He packed his books quickly, avoiding conversations, slipping out before anyone could stop him. She hesitated, then followed. Not closely enough to be obvious, but enough to observe. And what she saw surprised her. Kwame wasn't heading home. He was heading to work. The roadside was alive with noise, vendors calling out, cars passing, dust rising with every movement. Amma stood at a distance, partially hidden behind a small kiosk, watching as Kwame carefully arranged vegetables beside an older woman. His mother. The realization settled heavily in her chest. He moved differently here. Not like the quiet boy in class. Here he was responsible, attentive, present in a way that felt older than his years. Customers greeted him with familiarity. Some joked. Others bargained. And through it all he remained composed, patient, focused. Amma had never seen this version of life up close. Her world had always been insulated, structured, controlled, predictable. But this was real. Raw. Unfiltered. And suddenly everything about Kwame made sense. Not just his discipline. Not just his silence. But his restraint. She took a step forward without thinking. And then, Kwame saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Two worlds colliding without warning. Kwame's expression changed almost instantly, not into anger but into something more guarded. He straightened slightly, wiping his hands on his shirt as he stepped away from the stall. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Amma blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in his tone. "I didn't mean to intrude," she replied, her voice softer than usual. "I just saw you leave and followed me," he finished. There was no accusation in his voice. Just truth. Amma hesitated, then nodded. Kwame glanced back at his mother, who pretended not to notice, though her eyes lingered longer than necessary. "This is my life," he said finally. "There's nothing to see." But Amma shook her head slightly. "There's everything to see." The word surprised even her. Kwame didn't respond. Instead, he turned away, returning to the stall, signaling, without saying it, that the conversation was over. Amma stood there a moment longer, then quietly left. But something had changed. Not just in how she saw him, but in how she saw everything. That night, Amma couldn't sleep. Her room was quiet, comfortable, untouched by the struggles she had witnessed just hours earlier. But her mind refused to settle. Kwame's world lingered. The dust, the effort, the quiet strength. And for the first time she felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt, but responsibility. The next day at school she approached him directly. "I want to help you," she said. Kwame didn't even look up from his book. "I don't need help." "It's not like that," she insisted. "I just thought, maybe with your workload I could." "I said I don't need help." This time his voice was firmer. Amma paused, her confidence shaken. "You're talented, Kwame," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "You deserve more than this." That made him look up. Finally. "And what makes you think you decide what I deserve?" The question wasn't harsh, but it was sharp enough to cut through everything she had intended to say. Amma stepped back slightly, because for the first time, She realized she might not understand him at all. The tension between them didn't disappear. But it changed. They still competed in class, still challenged each other, still stood at the top together. But now there was something beneath it, something quieter, more complicated. Understanding. Or at least, the beginning of it. Kwame found himself thinking about her more than he expected. Not about what she said, but how she said it. There had been no arrogance in her offer. No pity. Just sincerity. And that unsettled him. Because sincerity was harder to reject. Amma, on the other hand, became more careful. She didn't push again. She didn't follow him. She simply observed, waiting, learning, trying to understand a world she had never needed to see before. Then one day something small, but important, happened. Kwame forgot his calculator. A simple thing. But during an important test. He sat still, staring at the paper. And before he could react, a calculator slid quietly onto his desk. He looked up. Amma didn't turn. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge it. But the gesture was clear. And in that silent moment, the wall between them cracked. Just a little. Kwame stared at the calculator long after the test had begun, his fingers hovering just above it as though touching it would mean accepting something he wasn't ready to accept. Around him, pens moved steadily, pages turned, and time slipped forward without hesitation. But for a brief moment, everything felt paused. Not because of the exam, but because of what the small object represented. It wasn't just help. It was understanding. And that made it harder to process. He finally picked it up, slowly, almost reluctantly, and began working through the questions. His mind was sharp as always, but something had shifted. He was no longer thinking only about numbers. He was thinking about Amma, about the way she had helped without drawing attention, without expecting acknowledgement, without making him feel small. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. After the test, he walked past her without speaking. But this time it wasn't avoidance. It was uncertainty. Because for the first time, Kwame didn't know how to respond to kindness that didn't come with condition. Amma noticed everything, even the things Kwame thought he had hidden. The hesitation before he used the calculator. The way he avoided eye contact afterward. The silence that lingered between them, not tense, but unfinished. She didn't expect a thank you. That wasn't why she had done it. But she did hope, quietly, that he understood. So she waited. Not for a response, but for a shift. Something small. Something real. And in the days that followed, she began to notice it. Kwame no longer left class immediately. He stayed a little longer, gathering his things more slowly. Once he even glanced in her direction. Not long, not obvious, but enough. It wasn't much. But to Amma, it meant everything. Because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Some people don't reject kindness because they don't want it. They reject it because they don't know how to hold it. At home, Amma's world remained unchanged, but it felt different now. Dinner conversations were no longer just background noise. Her father spoke more frequently about the scholarship, about expectations, about what it would mean for their family if she won. "You must secure it," he said one evening, his tone calm but firm. "Opportunities like this define futures." Amma nodded, but her mind drifted elsewhere. To Kwame. To the way he carried his life without anyone expecting anything from him, yet still giving everything. For the first time, Amma felt something she had never allowed herself to feel before. Doubt. Not in her abilities, but in her reasons. Was she chasing the scholarship because she wanted it, or because she was expected to? It happened after school, unexpectedly. Kwame found Amma sitting alone under the large mango tree near the field, her books spread out but untouched. He hesitated before approaching, his steps slower than usual. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. Amma looked up, surprised but not shocked. "I know," she replied. Silence followed. But this time it wasn't uncomfortable. Kwame shifted slightly, then added, "Thank you." It was simple. But it was everything. Amma smiled faintly, not wide, not exaggerated, just enough to show she understood the weight behind the words. "You're welcome," she said. And in that moment something changed between them. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But deeply. The classroom felt different again, but not in the way it had before. The competition was still there, but it no longer felt like a battle. It felt shared. Each challenge became something they both rose to, not just to outperform each other but to meet each other at the same level. Kwame began to notice things he hadn't allowed himself to notice before. The way Amma thought through problems aloud. The way she paused before answering, not out of doubt but out of care. And Amma, in turn, began to see the quiet resilience in Kwame's every action. The discipline, the restraint, the strength. They still didn't talk much. But they didn't need to. Because sometimes, connection doesn't begin with words. It begins with understanding. And neither of them realized it yet. But what they were building was no longer about the scholarship. The distance between Kwame and Amma was no longer measured in steps or silence. It was something far more delicate. It lived in the pauses between their conversations, in the glances that lasted just a second too long, in the way they now seemed aware of each other even without speaking. The classroom had become a shared space in a new way, not just for learning but for something neither of them had planned for. Kwame found himself arriving earlier than usual, choosing seats where he could see her without being obvious. He told himself it was habit, nothing more, but deep down he knew better. Amma, on the other hand, had stopped pretending she wasn't paying attention. She noticed when he was tired, when his handwriting changed, when his focus slipped for even a moment. They were still competitors. But now they were also witnesses to each other's lives. And that made everything more complicated. One evening, Kwame stayed longer at the stall than usual. The sun had already begun to set, painting the sky in soft orange and fading gold, but customers still came, and his mother still needed help. His younger sister sat nearby, doing her homework with a small pencil, occasionally glancing up at him as though drawing strength from his presence. "Kwame," his mother said gently, "you should go study." He shook his head. "I'll finish this first." But his voice carried something different that day, fatigue. Not just physical but deeper. The kind that builds quietly over time. When Amma passed by later, she didn't stop this time. She simply watched from across the road. She didn't want to intrude again. But what she saw stayed with her. Kwame wasn't just working hard. He was carrying everything. And for the first time she realized, he wasn't just fighting for a scholarship. He was fighting for a future that included others. Amma couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day she approached one of the teachers quietly, asking questions about exam materials, resources, and extra support programs. She didn't mention Kwame's name directly, but her intentions were clear. If a student needs assistance, the teacher said carefully, it must be offered equally to all. Amma nodded. But she knew that wasn't always how life worked. That evening she made a decision, one that felt small but carried weight. She arranged for additional study materials to be made available, anonymously. When Kwame found them the next day, new textbooks, practice questions, resources he had never had access to, he paused. Something about it didn't feel random. It felt intentional. And for the first time, he began to suspect. Kwame approached her after class. "Was it you?" he asked. Amma didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Yes." The honesty caught him off guard. "You shouldn't have done that." "I know." "Then why did you?" Amma hesitated, her usual confidence replaced by something more vulnerable. "Because you shouldn't have to struggle just to be seen." Kwame's expression changed, not into anger but something more conflicted. "I don't want special treatment." "It's not special treatment," she replied softly. "It's fairness." Silence stretched between them. And for the first time, neither of them had an answer. The closer the scholarship exam came, the more everything intensified. The pressure. The expectations. The awareness of what was at stake. But something else grew too. Feelings. Unspoken but undeniable. Kwame tried to push it away, focusing on his responsibilities, his goals, his reality. But Amma had become part of his thoughts in ways he couldn't control. Amma too felt it, stronger with each passing day. But she also knew something he didn't. If she won, her life would move forward exactly as planned. If he lost, his might not move at all. And that truth created a line between them. A line neither of them had drawn. But both of them could feel. Because sometimes, the hardest part of love isn't distance. It's knowing what stands between you. The days leading up to the scholarship exam carried a strange stillness, as though the entire school was holding its breath. Conversations became shorter, laughter less frequent, and even the teachers seemed more deliberate in their words, aware that what was coming would shape futures in ways none of them could fully predict. For Kwame, the pressure felt familiar, but heavier now, sharpened by the knowledge that he wasn't just competing against expectations, but against someone he had come to understand in ways he hadn't intended. Amma felt it too, though in a different way. Her world had always been built on preparation, on certainty, on knowing the path ahead. But now that path felt uncertain, not because she doubted her ability but because she could no longer ignore the emotional weight attached to the outcome. Winning no longer felt simple. It felt complicated. They spoke less. Not because they had nothing to say, but because there was too much. It happened after school, under the same mango tree where they had first spoken honestly. The air was warm, quiet, almost expectant. "You've been avoiding me," Amma said. Kwame shook his head slightly. "No. I've just been thinking." "About the exam?" "About everything." She studied him carefully, sensing something deeper beneath his calm. "Then say it," she said softly. Kwame hesitated, then looked at her fully. "If I win, everything changes." Amma nodded slowly. "And if you don't?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "Then nothing does." The words settled heavily between them. Because they were true. The truth came quietly, without planning, without preparation. "I didn't expect you," Kwame said. Amma blinked. "What do you mean?" "You changed things," he continued, his voice steady but softer than usual. "Not the scholarship, just everything else." Amma felt her breath catch slightly. "I didn't plan for that either," she admitted. Silence followed, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything they hadn't said. Full of everything they were beginning to feel. And in that moment, they both understood something undeniable. This was no longer just about competition. The morning arrived faster than expected. The air felt different, cooler, sharper, filled with quiet tension as students took their seats in the examination hall. Papers were distributed. Instructions were given. And then, silence. Kwame sat still for a moment before beginning, his mind focused, disciplined, steady. Every question felt like a step forward, every answer a reflection of everything he had worked for. Across the room, Amma worked just as carefully, her thoughts precise, her confidence grounded, but not untouched by emotion. She was aware of him. Not in a distracting way, but in a way that reminded her what this moment meant. They weren't just writing an exam. They were deciding a future. When it ended quietly. No announcement. No immediate result. Just the sound of papers being collected and chairs shifting as students stood slowly, processing what had just happened. Kwame stepped outside first, the sunlight hitting his face as he exhaled deeply. It was done. Whatever came next was no longer in his control. Amma joined him moments later. Neither of them spoke at first. Because there was nothing left to say about the exam. Only what came after. "You did well," she said finally. Kwame nodded. "So did you." They stood there side by side, not looking at each other, but not needing to. Because for the first time, the outcome didn't feel like the most important thing. The days after the exam stretched longer than any that had come before. Time seemed to slow, dragging each hour into something heavier than it should have been. At school, conversations returned, but not in the same way. Everything revolved around one question. Who would be chosen? Kwame tried to return to routine, but even routine felt different now. At the stall, his hands moved automatically, arranging vegetables, counting change, responding to customers, but his mind was elsewhere. Every quiet moment gave space for thoughts he couldn't control. Had he done enough? Had it been enough? Amma's world was no less tense. At home, the expectation had grown louder, even in silence. Her father didn't need to ask how the exam went, he already believed he knew. And that belief pressed against her more than any spoken words ever could. For both of them, the waiting became its own kind of test. The assembly ground was full again, but this time the energy was different. No excitement. No curiosity. Just anticipation. The principal stood at the front, a single envelope in his hand. It looked small, too small to carry something so life-changing. Kwame stood quietly in the crowd, his expression calm, his hands steady at his sides. Amma stood not far away, her posture composed, but her heart racing in a way she couldn't control. This year's recipient of the Global Excellence Scholarship. The pause felt endless. Is Amma Mensah? For a moment, there was silence. Then applause. Loud. Immediate. Expected. Amma didn't move. Kwame didn't react. But everything changed. Amma walked forward slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The applause continued around her, but it felt distant, muted, disconnected from what she was actually feeling. She accepted the certificate. Smiled. Did everything she was supposed to do. But her eyes searched the crowd. For him. Kwame stood still, his face composed, his expression unreadable. If there was disappointment, he didn't show it. If there was pain, he carried it quietly, just as he carried everything else. Their eyes met. And in that moment, no words were needed, because both of them understood exactly what had been lost. Congratulations, Kwame said. They stood apart from the crowd now, the noise fading into the background. Amma looked at him, searching for something, anything, that would make this feel right. Thank you, she replied softly. The words felt wrong. Kwame nodded but didn't smile. You earned it. Amma shook her head slightly. It doesn't feel like it. Kwame looked at her then, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something deeper. You don't get to feel guilty for winning, he said quietly. I'm not guilty, she replied. I just... Don't, he interrupted gently. Please. Silence followed. Because there was nothing either of them could say that would change what had happened. Life didn't stop. It never did. Amma's world moved forward quickly. Preparations, paperwork, conversations about travel and opportunity. Everything she had worked for was now unfolding exactly as it was meant to. But something felt missing. Kwame returned to his routine. School, home, stall, study. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. They saw each other less. Not because they were avoiding it, but because life had begun to pull them in different directions. The connection they had built didn't disappear. But it became quieter. More distant. More fragile. Because sometimes, the hardest part isn't losing. It's moving forward as if nothing was lost at all. The days after the announcement moved quickly for everyone except them. For the school it was a celebration. For Amma's family, it was a victory. But for Kwame and Amma, it felt like something quieter, something that didn't have a name. They no longer spoke under the mango tree. They no longer lingered after class. Even their shared glances had faded into something more careful, more controlled, as though both of them were trying not to reopen something that had never fully closed. It wasn't avoidance. It was protection. Kwame returned to his routine completely, almost deliberately. He woke earlier, worked longer, studied harder. Not because he had given up, but because he refused to let disappointment define him. Still, there were moments, small, quiet ones, where everything slowed and the weight of what could have been settled in. Amma noticed the change even from a distance. And what hurt most wasn't that he was gone from her life. It was that he seemed to be learning how to live without her in it. Amma had everything she was supposed to want. The scholarship, the recognition, the future. But none of it felt complete. One evening, as preparations continued around her, documents, phone calls, travel plans, she found herself sitting alone, staring at the acceptance letter. It represented opportunity, success, everything she had been raised to pursue. But for the first time, she questioned it. Not because it wasn't valuable, but because of what it had cost. Kwame hadn't said it. He hadn't blamed her. He hadn't even shown pain. But she had seen it. And now she couldn't unsee it. Because sometimes, silence speaks louder than disappointment. Kwame didn't talk about the result. Not to his mother. Not to his friends. Not even to himself. But the truth was there, present in everything he did even when he tried to ignore it. One evening, as he sat beside his sister helping her with her homework, she looked up at him and asked a simple question. Did you win? Kwame paused. Just for a second. Then smiled. No, he said gently. She frowned slightly. Why? He didn't answer immediately. Because how do you explain something like that to someone who still believes everything is fair? I'll try again, he said finally. And in that moment, he wasn't just comforting her. He was convincing himself. Amma couldn't carry it anymore. The next day she went looking for him. Not in the classroom, not in the courtyard, but where she knew he would be. At the roadside. Kwame saw her before she spoke this time. And for once, he didn't turn away. I need to talk to you, she said. He nodded. They stepped aside, away from the noise, into a quieter space. I'm thinking of turning it down, she said. Kwame blinked. What? The scholarship, she continued. I don't think I can take it. The words hung between them, heavy, unexpected. Kwame shook his head slowly. No. Amma frowned. No. No, he repeated. You don't get to give up your future because of me. It's not just because of you, she said quickly. It's because it doesn't feel right. Kwame looked at her, his expression steady. Things don't have to feel right to be right. They stood there, facing each other, both holding on to something neither of them had fully defined. You changed things for me, Amma said quietly. You made me see things differently. Kwame nodded. And you did the same, he replied. Silence settled again, but this time, it wasn't uncertain. It was clear. You should go, he said finally. Amma's chest tightened slightly. And you? She asked. Kwame gave a small, honest smile. I'll find my own way. Amma studied him, searching for doubt, but finding none. Only strength. Only quiet certainty. And in that moment, she understood something important. Love isn't always about staying. Sometimes, it's about letting someone become who they're meant to be. even if it means becoming something else yourself. The day came quietly. There were no grand announcements, no dramatic moments, no final speech that captured everything they felt. Just a morning like any other, sunlight stretching across the school grounds, students moving between classes, life continuing as though nothing was changing. But everything was. Amma stood near the entrance, her bag packed, her future waiting just beyond the gate. Around her, people offered congratulations, encouragement, pride-filled smiles. Her family stood close, already speaking about the next phase of her life, the opportunities ahead, the expectations that would follow her wherever she went. But her eyes searched for only one person. Kwame arrived late that morning. Not by accident. By choice. He saw her immediately. And for a moment, neither of them moved. They stepped away from the crowd without speaking, finding a quiet space just beyond the school walls. The world felt distant there, muted, as though giving them a moment that belonged only to them. "I didn't think you'd come," Amma said softly. Kwame nodded. "I almost didn't." Silence settled, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of everything they had shared, everything they hadn't said, everything they were about to leave behind. "I'm glad you did," she added. Kwame looked at her, really looked at her, as though trying to remember every detail. "You're going to do great things," he said. Amma smiled faintly. "So are you." They both knew those words were true. But they also knew something else. Their paths were no longer the same. The car was waiting. Time had run out. Amma turned to him, her expression steady, but her eyes carrying something deeper. "This isn't the end," she said. Kwame didn't respond immediately. Because part of him wanted to believe that. And another part of him knew better. "Take care of yourself," he said instead. Amma nodded. Then, after a brief hesitation, she stepped forward and hugged him. It was quick, simple. But it carried everything they couldn't say. When she pulled away, neither of them tried to hold on longer. Because they both understood. Some moments aren't meant to last. They're meant to change you. Life didn't pause after Amma left. It continued. As it always does. Kwame returned to his routine, but something about it felt different now. Not empty, but quieter. The spaces she once filled weren't replaced. They simply remained open. At school, her absence was noticeable but not disruptive. Students adjusted. Teachers moved on. The world reorganized itself quickly as though she had never been there. But for Kwame, she had. And that couldn't be undone. He studied harder than ever, not out of competition but out of purpose. The scholarship had been one path, but not the only one. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think beyond what was immediately in front of him. Not dreams. Not yet. But possibilities. Months passed. Slowly. Steadily. And in that time, something changed in Kwame, not externally, not dramatically, but internally, in a way that reshaped how he saw himself and his future. He applied for opportunities he once would have ignored. Entered competitions he once would have avoided. Spoke up in spaces where he once stayed silent. Not because he had become someone else, but because he had finally begun to believe that he could be more than what his circumstances suggested. And somewhere far away, Amma was doing the same. Different worlds, different paths, but connected by something that had never truly disappeared. Because sometimes, the people who change your life aren't meant to stay in it forever. They're meant to show you who you can become. Years passed in ways that felt both slow and sudden. Life unfolded differently for each of them, shaped by choices, circumstances, and the quiet determination that had always lived beneath the surface. Kwame was no longer the boy who avoided attention. He had grown, not just in knowledge but in presence. Opportunities he once thought impossible had slowly begun to appear, each one earned through persistence, resilience, and a belief that had taken time to build. He now stood in spaces that once felt unreachable, academic forums, community projects, mentorship programs, places where his voice mattered. But even as his world expanded, there were moments when his thoughts drifted back to a simpler time. To a classroom. To a quiet connection. To a girl who had once changed how he saw everything. Amma's journey had been just as transformative. Abroad, she had excelled in every measurable way, top of her class, recognized, respected, admired. But success, she realized, was not the same as fulfillment. The more she achieved, the more she began to question what truly mattered. And often, without intending to, her thoughts returned to the same place. To him. Kwame wasn't expecting it. The invitation came through a community event, an educational program bringing together young leaders from different parts of the world. He had been selected to speak about his work, his journey, his impact. He arrived early as he always did. Prepared. Focused. Unaware. until he saw her. Amma stood across the hall, speaking with a group of organizers, her posture confident, her presence unmistakable. She looked different, more refined, more experienced, but still undeniably herself. Kwame froze. Not because he didn't recognize her, but because he hadn't expected to. And when her eyes met his, everything they had left behind suddenly felt present again. They spoke later. Not immediately, because neither of them knew how to begin. But eventually they found themselves standing face to face once more. "It's been a while," Amma said. Kwame smiled slightly. "Yeah, it has." There was no awkwardness. Just a quiet awareness of everything that had changed, and everything that hadn't. "You've done well," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. "So have you," he replied. And for the first time in years, they weren't competing. They were simply equal. The conversation flowed more easily than either of them expected. They spoke about their journeys, their struggles, their growth, not in detail but in understanding. There was no need to explain everything. They already knew the parts that mattered. "I used to think winning that scholarship was everything," Amma admitted. Kwame nodded. "I used to think losing it meant everything." She looked at him. "And now?" Kwame paused. "Now I think it was just one moment." Amma smiled softly. "Yeah," she said. "Just one moment." But they both knew. It had been more than that. Because some moments don't define your life. They redirect it. As the event came to an end, they found themselves walking side by side once more, just like they had years ago. Only now, everything felt different. Stronger. Clear. More honest. "So, what happens now?" Amma asked. Kwame glanced at her, then looked ahead. "I don't know," he said. And for once, that didn't feel uncertain. It felt open. Amma nodded. Because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Love doesn't always arrive when life is simple. Sometimes, it waits. Until you're ready to understand it. The evening stretched slowly across the city, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and fading blue as the event came to a close. People began to leave in small groups, their conversations light, their steps unhurried, unaware of the quiet significance unfolding between two people standing just slightly apart from the rest. Kwame and Amma remained outside the building, neither rushing to leave, neither quite ready to walk away again. The years between them no longer felt like distance, but they still carried weight. Not regret, not loss, just time. Time that had shaped them into who they had become. "It feels different now," Amma said softly, her voice steady but reflective. Kwame nodded. "It is." They weren't the same people anymore. The pressure that once defined them had faded. The expectations that once controlled them had loosened their grip. And in their place, something new had formed. Clarity. But clarity, they were beginning to realize, came with its own kind of question. They walked slowly along the quiet street, side by side, their steps naturally in sync as though no time had passed at all. Around them, the world continued, cars moving, lights flickering on, distant voices blending into the rhythm of the evening. But for them, everything felt contained within the moment. "I thought success would answer everything," Amma admitted. Kwame glanced at her. "Did it?" She shook her head slightly. "It answered some things, but not the ones that mattered most." Kwame understood that more than she knew. His own journey had taught him something similar, that achievement could open doors, but it didn't always tell you which ones to walk through. "What matters most now?" he asked. Amma didn't answer immediately. Because the answer wasn't simple. It never had been. They stopped walking. Not because they had reached a destination, but because something within the moment asked them to pause. Amma turned to him first. "I missed you," she said. The words came quietly, but they carried years within them. Kwame didn't look surprised. He had felt it too. "I know," he replied. She searched his face, looking for hesitation, but found none. "I didn't understand it before," she continued. "What we had. What it meant." Kwame exhaled slowly. "We weren't ready," he said. Amma nodded. And for the first time, they weren't trying to define it. They were simply acknowledging it. The silence that followed wasn't uncertain. It was clear. Because now the question wasn't about the past. It was about the present. And what they were willing to do with it. Amma took a small step closer. "Life isn't pulling us in different directions anymore," she said. Kwame looked at her, understanding exactly what she meant. "And if it does?" he asked quietly. Amma smiled faintly. "Then we decide if we're walking in those directions, together." Kwame held her gaze. Not searching. Not questioning. Just choosing. The night had fully settled now, the sky dark and endless above them, scattered with stars that felt both distant and present, like everything they had been and everything they had become. Kwame reached for her hand. This time, not by accident. Not out of uncertainty. But with intention. Amma didn't hesitate. Because now there was nothing left to prove. Nothing left to compete for. Nothing left to question. Only something to build. Together. Life doesn't always give us the love we expect, Amma said softly. But it gives us the love we need, Kwame finished. And in that moment, it wasn't about the scholarship. It wasn't about who won or who lost. It wasn't even about the years they had spent apart. It was about something deeper. Something quieter. Something real. A love that had been tested by distance, strengthened by growth, and chosen fully, finally, by both of them. And this time, they weren't walking separate paths. They were creating one. Together. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the greatest success isn't what you achieve. It's who you become. And who you choose to walk that journey with.